It all started with a simple decision. A practical one, really. I needed extra cash, and I had space I wasn't using. My garage sat there, empty, collecting dust and old memories I didn't care to revisit. So, I put up an ad. Garage for rent. Secure, quiet location. The responses came quickly, but one stood out, a polite, professional inquiry from someone named Mr. Cole. He said he needed storage for a few months. He offered to pay up front, in cash. It seemed straightforward, easy. Too easy. I remember meeting them, Mr. Cole and his wife, on a cold, quiet evening. The streetlights barely illuminated their black van as they pulled up. They were polite, almost too polite. Mr. Cole had a firm handshake, but his hand was cold, almost damp. His wife smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They barely said a word about what they planned to store, and I didn't ask. Why would I? They moved in the next night. I saw them unloading crates, heavy ones, from their van. They worked quietly, efficiently, and always after dark. It struck me as odd, but not odd enough to say anything. People are strange, I told myself. Everyone has their quirks. But then, things started to change. The first sign was the smell. It hit me one morning as I left for work, a faint, metallic tang in the air near the garage. I thought maybe it was rust or something leaking from their crates. But the smell grew stronger every day. Then came the sounds. Faint at first. A soft scratching, like nails on metal. And whispers. Not words, exactly. Just the low hum of voices, too quiet to make out, but impossible to ignore. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, maybe. Or my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And then I saw it. One night, as I was locking up, I noticed a shadow dart across the garage doorway. Quick, like a flicker. Too fast to be human. My stomach turned, but I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. It had to be. But it wasn't. I didn't know it then, but I had let something into my life that didn't belong here. Something I couldn't understand. If I had known what they really were, I would have never opened that door. I've always been the kind of person who makes do with what I have. Life hasn't been easy, but it hasn't been impossible either. My house, small, a little rundown, sits on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. You know the kind. Rows of identical homes, lawns neatly trimmed, and neighbors who wave but never ask questions. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, and that was fine by me. But lately, things had gotten tight. The bills piled up faster than I could pay them, and my job didn't stretch far enough. I started looking for ways to make extra cash, and that's when I had the idea. The garage. It wasn't much, a single car space, filled with odds and ends I didn't use anymore. Boxes of old clothes, a broken lawnmower, and a few tools collecting dust. I figured, why not put it to work? I could clear it out, post an ad online, and rent it out for storage. Easy money. The neighborhood felt normal. But looking back, maybe I missed the signs. The street was always too quiet. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears, making you notice every little sound. The creak of a tree branch. The hum of a street light. And then, there was the dog. Mrs. Onom's German Shepherd, Duke, was usually calm. A friendly dog that wandered the neighborhood, wagging his tail and sniffing at everyone's front porch. But the day I cleaned out the garage, Duke wouldn't come near it. He stood at the edge of my driveway, his ears flat, growling low in his throat. His teeth bared like he'd seen something I couldn't. I tried calling him over, but he just backed away, barking sharply. It wasn't like him. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Dogs bark. Maybe he smelled a raccoon or something. I shrugged it off and went back to cleaning. That night, I posted the ad, garage for rent, secure, quiet location. I didn't expect much. Just a few inquiries. Maybe someone needing space for old furniture or tools. It felt like a small step towards solving my problems. Something simple. But as the ad went live and the responses came in, I couldn't shake the image of Duke, standing there, refusing to move. And maybe, if I'd paid attention to that moment, if I'd listened to the way his growl cut through the quiet, I might have thought twice. But I didn't. Instead, I focused on the practicality of it. A chance to make ends meet. A way to ease the stress of late notices and overdue bills. It was just a garage. A simple, empty space. Or at least, that's what I thought. I should have known better. Sometimes, the quiet isn't peace. Sometimes, it's a warning. It didn't take long to get a response to the ad. A few people asked about the garage, but one message stood out: Mr. Cole. His reply was short, polite, and professional. He mentioned that he and his wife needed a secure space to store some belongings for a few months. He offered to pay cash and asked if they could see the place that evening. That evening, just as the sun began to set, they arrived. I remember hearing the hum of their van before I saw it. A black vehicle, spotless, pulling up smoothly into the driveway. The Coles stepped out together, moving with an unhurried precision, like they'd practiced it. Mr. Cole was tall, clean-shaven, dressed in slacks and a button-up shirt. Mrs. Cole was shorter, slim, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a cardigan and gloves, which seemed strange for the weather. It wasn't cold. They greeted me with smiles. Not wide or warm, but practiced. Polished. Mr. Cole's voice was low, and even as he introduced himself and his wife. When he extended his hand, I hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, but his skin was cold, almost clammy. It caught me off guard. I glanced at his wife, who stood quietly by his side, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't say much, just nodded occasionally, as if to confirm everything he said. After a quick greeting, Mr. Cole got straight to the point. He wanted to see the garage. I led them around the side of the house, flipping on the single light bulb that hung above the door. It flickered before settling into a weak, yellow glow. I unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting them look around. They didn't ask many questions. Mr. Cole walked the perimeter, inspecting the walls and corners, while Mrs. Cole stayed near the doorway, her eyes scanning the space but never lingering on anything. Then came the questions. Direct, almost clinical. Was the garage secure? Had I ever had problems with break-ins? Would I need to access the space while they were renting it? I answered honestly. The garage was secure. Sturdy locks, no windows, no history of trouble. And no, I wouldn't need to access it. Once they moved in, the space would be theirs until the rental ended. Satisfied, Mr. Cole nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. He handed it to me without hesitation. Inside was cash. Stacks of it. Enough to cover 6 months, all paid up front. It felt too easy, too clean. But I didn't question it. I needed the money, and they seemed trustworthy enough. Who pays in advance like that unless they're serious? After I agreed to the terms, they asked if they could move in that night. Tonight? I asked, surprised. Mr. Cole smiled, his expression unreadable. We like to settle things quickly, he said. It's better that way. I hesitated for a moment but eventually nodded. Why not? The garage was empty, and the cash was already in my hands. They thanked me, their words polite and measured, and said they'd be back in a few hours with their belongings. As they left, I stood in the driveway watching their van disappear down the street. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the cold handshake or the gloves or the way they moved like they were following a script. It was the silence that followed. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath after they drove away, the stillness pressing down on me. I shook it off and went back inside, convincing myself it was just nerves. New people, a little cash in hand. It was nothing more than a change in routine. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of Mrs. Cole standing in the doorway, her gloved hands resting lightly on her stomach, played over and over in my mind. And for the first time, I wondered, what kind of people pay 6 months in cash to rent a dusty garage in the middle of nowhere? The Coles moved in quietly that same night. I watched from my kitchen window as their van pulled into the driveway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. They worked quickly, unloading several large, covered crates and rolling them into the garage on a dolly. I couldn't see what was inside the crates. Everything was wrapped tightly in thick, dark fabric. They didn't make much noise, barely speaking to each other. It was as though they had done this 100 times before. I went to bed thinking that would be the last of it for the night, but I was wrong. At around midnight, I woke up to a faint clinking sound. It wasn't loud, just persistent enough to pull me from my sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling something outside, but as I sat up and listened, it became clear that the sound was coming from the garage. I got up and peered out the window. The garage light was on, spilling a dim yellow glow onto the driveway. I could see shadows shifting inside, faint and fleeting, like someone pacing back and forth. The next morning, I decided to check in with them casually. It was my garage after all, and I figured it wasn't unreasonable to ask if everything was okay. Mr. Cole answered the door before I could even knock, as if he'd been waiting. His expression was calm, and he greeted me with that same polite smile. "Everything's fine," he said before I could even ask. "Just getting settled." His tone left no room for further questions. Still, I couldn't help but notice the faint metallic smell wafting out from behind him. It was sharp, like rusted iron, and it clung to the air even after the door was closed. That smell didn't go away. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things. Small, strange things that didn't sit right. For one, the Coles never left the house during the day. Their van stayed parked in the same spot, as if it were a permanent fixture. They only accessed the garage at night. Around the same time every evening, I'd hear the soft creak of the garage door opening, followed by their hushed voices and the shuffle of heavy objects being moved around. They also insisted on installing their own locks. For privacy, Mr. Cole explained when he handed me a set of keys. "Don't worry, we'll leave a copy for you, just in case." But the locks weren't ordinary. They were heavy-duty, reinforced, and installed from the inside. It seemed excessive for a space meant to store a few belongings, but I didn't argue. The cash they'd paid up front had already eased my financial worries, and I didn't want to jeopardize that. Then there were the noises. It started with faint whispers. I'd hear them late at night, so soft and muffled that I couldn't make out the words. Sometimes there were scratching sounds, like something or someone was dragging metal across the concrete floor. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just organizing their stuff, or maybe the garage was settling in ways it never had before. But one night, the noises were louder, clearer. I pressed my ear against the wall separating my bedroom from the garage, straining to catch what I could. It wasn't whispers anymore. It was low, rhythmic, like chanting. I stayed there, frozen, trying to make sense of it, until the sound suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, almost unnatural, and I found myself holding my breath. Then, without warning, there was a loud thud, followed by the unmistakable scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The next morning, I went out to check the garage. Not to confront them, I wasn't brave enough for that, but just to see if anything seemed out of place. The metallic smell was stronger than ever. It hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharp and acrid, like it had seeped into the walls. I stood there for a while, staring at the locked garage door, wondering what they were keeping in there. I thought about knocking, about asking them directly, but something in the back of my mind stopped me. What would I even say? And more importantly, did I really want to know the answer? I was taking the trash out one afternoon when Mrs. Onom called me over from across the street. She was one of those neighbors who always seemed to know what was happening before anyone else, the kind of person you'd expect to have an opinion about everything. She waved me over with her usual bright smile, but when I got closer, her face changed. She glanced toward the garage, her expression tense, like she was about to say something she wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "You rented out your garage, didn't you?" she asked, keeping her voice low. I nodded, unsure where this was going. "Yeah, to a nice couple." "Why?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the garage for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she said, "You know, strange things have happened around here before. Years ago." I frowned. "Strange things." She leaned in slightly, as if afraid someone might overhear. People moving in who don't belong. They look normal, act polite, but they're not what they seem. And they always rent spaces like yours, out of sight, out of mind. Just... She paused, her voice dropping even lower. Not everything that looks human is human. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell her she was being ridiculous, but the way she looked at me made it hard. Her eyes weren't just serious, they were scared. Before I could say anything, she shook her head. "Just be careful," she said, then turned and walked back to her house without another word. Her warning stayed with me. I told myself it was just gossip, the kind of thing small-town neighbors say to stir up drama, but it planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. That night, I started paying closer attention. The first thing I noticed was the trash. A few days earlier, I'd thrown out a package of raw meat that had gone bad. It had been tied up in a plastic bag at the bottom of the bin, but when I checked the next morning, it was gone. The rest of the trash was untouched, just the meat was missing. I shrugged it off as an animal getting into the bin, but then it happened again. Another package of spoiled meat vanished, and the lid to the bin was still sealed tight. Around the same time, I started noticing movement in the garage at odd hours. Not just shadows or sounds, but flashes of something I couldn't quite make out. It was fast, jerky, like whatever it was didn't move the way people do. The more I noticed, the harder it was to ignore. One night, I decided to take things a step further. I had an old security camera sitting in a drawer, one of those cheap ones you could sync to your phone. I set it up in the corner of the garage when the Coles weren't around, tucking it into a spot where it wouldn't be seen. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd watch the footage and see nothing unusual, but when I checked the next morning, what I saw made my stomach drop. The footage started out normal enough. The Coles came into the garage around midnight, like they always did. They were carrying something, a bundle wrapped in cloth, but the camera couldn't pick up enough detail to tell what it was. They set the bundle down and started pacing. At first, they looked like themselves, calm, composed, their movements precise. But then, something changed. Mr. Cole reached up and grabbed the skin at his neck. He pulled. What I saw next didn't make sense. It was like he was peeling himself, the outer layer of his skin sliding off like a suit. Underneath was something taller, thinner, and impossibly stretched, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face, if you could call it that, was blank and smooth, except for two dark slits where eyes should have been. Mrs. Cole followed suit, pulling off her gloves and revealing hands that were more like claws. She shed her outer layer too, revealing the same grotesque shape as her partner. I watched in horror as they moved toward the bundle they'd brought in. They crouched over it, their elongated forms blocking the camera's view of what they were doing. But I could hear it. Wet, crunching sounds that made my skin crawl. Then one of them stopped. It turned its head slowly, directly toward the camera. For a moment, I thought it was just coincidence, that it had heard something nearby. But then it leaned closer, its dark, hollow eyes staring straight into the lens, like it knew. Like it knew I was watching. The screen went black. I checked the camera later and found it completely fried, as if someone had smashed it or overloaded it with electricity. Whatever I had just seen, it wasn't going to let me watch anymore. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. But no matter how hard I tried, one thought kept coming back to me, louder and louder. Mrs. Onome was right. I don't know what pushed me to confront them. Maybe it was desperation, maybe fear mixed with anger, or maybe I just needed answers. But by the time I found myself standing outside the garage with a crowbar in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I knew there was no turning back. The garage was silent, as it always was during the day. The faint metallic smell still hung in the air, stronger now, making my stomach churn. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the heavy lock on the door, before prying it open. The door creaked loudly, and the air inside hit me like a wall, stale, thick, and suffocating. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and what I saw made me stop cold. Symbols, drawn in blood, covered the walls. They weren't random markings, they were deliberate, forming patterns that seemed to shift if I looked at them too long. The floor was worse. Bones, human bones, lay in a haphazard pile in one corner, some cracked open as if something had been feeding on them. In the center of the room, something pulsed. It wasn't light exactly, but it glowed faintly, its edges shifting and rippling like a wound torn into the fabric of the air itself. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard them. Looking for something? The voice was low, guttural, like gravel grinding together, and it came from behind me. I turned sharply, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and there they were, the Coles, or what was left of them. Mr. Cole's frame was stretched impossibly tall, his limbs long and angular, his fingers tipped with claws that scraped against the concrete as he moved. His face was an inhuman mask, smooth and featureless except for those hollow slits where his eyes should have been. Mrs. Cole was no better, her movements jerky and unnatural, her head tilting too far to one side as if her neck had no bones. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice echoing strangely, as if more than one mouth was speaking. I stumbled back, gripping the crowbar tighter, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. What are you?" They didn't answer. Instead, they stepped closer, their movements deliberate and predatory. "You've seen too much," Mr. Cole growled, his elongated form blocking the doorway. "And now, you'll serve a purpose." I swung the crowbar blindly, the metal whistling through the air. It didn't hit anything. They moved too fast, faster than anything should, their shapes blurring as they closed in. Panic surged through me, and I backed toward the pulsating portal, its faint light casting their twisted forms into even sharper relief. They were hurting me, trapping me. "Don't fight it," Mrs. Cole whispered, her voice chillingly calm. "It's already decided." I did the only thing I could think of. I swung the flashlight toward the portal, smashing it against the edge of the glowing rift. The light flickered wildly, and the portal seemed to ripple violently, its glow intensifying. For a split second, the Coles hesitated. It was enough. I darted past them, adrenaline overpowering the terror in my veins. They lunged, claws scraping my shoulder, but I didn't stop. I ran, slamming the door shut behind me and jamming the crowbar through the handle. Inside, I heard a low, guttural roar, followed by a deep rumble that shook the ground beneath my feet. The light from the portal flared through the cracks of the garage, blinding and searing, and then, an explosion. The sound was deafening, the force throwing me to the ground. For a moment, there was nothing but brightness, like staring into the heart of a star. When it faded, all that was left was silence. I pulled myself up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest, and turned toward the garage. The door was gone, blown clean off its hinges. Inside, everything was scorched, walls blackened, the floor cracked and smoldering. But the Coles, they were gone. No bodies, no bones. Just the faint smell of burnt metal and the eerie, suffocating silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the wreckage, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they weren't human. And I had a sinking suspicion they weren't finished. The days after the explosion were quieter than they should have been. No police sirens, no curious neighbors poking around. It was as though the entire block had agreed to pretend it never happened. For everyone else, life carried on like nothing had changed. But for me, nothing felt the same. Every shadow seemed too long, every noise in the dark too deliberate. I couldn't step outside without feeling eyes on me, and I couldn't stay inside without hearing faint scratches that might have been my imagination, or something worse. I stopped sleeping properly. My nights became long stretches of pacing, staring at the ruined garage from my bedroom window. Sometimes, I thought I saw shapes moving in the charred remains, but every time I checked, there was nothing there. Just the scorched walls and the faint outline of where the portal had been. A week later, Mrs. Onome came by. She looked older, wearier than I'd ever seen her. Without a word, she handed me a folded newspaper, yellowed and brittle at the edges. "Thought you should see this," she said, her voice low. The headline read, "Mysterious disappearances plague neighborhood. Locals blame the shadows." The article detailed accounts from decades ago. Families vanishing without a trace. Strange lights seen at night. A couple renting properties in the area, always described as polite, but strange. And every story ended the same way, with an unexplained explosion, a ruined home, and no answers. "You didn't invite them in, did you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Mrs. Onome shook her head and left, muttering something under her breath that I couldn't make out. That night, as I sat on my couch, trying to distract myself with old movies, my phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "Thank you for letting us in. See you soon." My hands went cold. I stared at the screen, willing the words to disappear, but they stayed sharp and unyielding. I tried to trace the number, but it led nowhere. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. I told myself it was a prank, some cruel joke, but deep down, I knew better. The final straw came 2 nights later. It was past midnight, and the house was eerily quiet. Then I heard it, a knock at the door. 3 sharp, deliberate raps. I froze. No one knocks that late unless it's an emergency, or something worse. The knocking came again, louder this time. Slowly, I crept to the door, every nerve screaming at me to ignore it. But I had to know. When I opened the door, no one was there. Instead, a small package sat on the doorstep, plain brown paper tied with twine. A single drop of something dark and wet stained the top corner. I picked it up cautiously, the weight of it far heavier than it should have been. Inside was a note, written in jagged crimson strokes. "We're closer than you think." The whispers started then, faint and distant, but growing louder. The sound of growls joined them, low and guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled back into the house, locking the door and every window, but it didn't matter. The sounds were inside now, pressing against the walls, seeping into the floor. The last thing I remember is the lights flickering, the room going impossibly dark, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, nothing. And just like that, my life changed forever. The Coles were gone, but their presence lingered, waiting, watching. If you ever hear a knock in the dead of night, ask yourself, who or what are you inviting in? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that'll make you think twice about the darkness.